Welcome to the Story Apothecary, a podcast filled with healing and medicinal stories. My name is Nana Tomova, and I'm a traditional storyteller and a pharmacist, and stories are medicines which I dispense. In this podcast, you'll find my prescriptions of stories for the body, mind, heart, soul, and for the earth. So I invite you to join me as we enter the healing world of stories together. Welcome to another story in the Story Apothecary. It's been a couple of months again. This autumn has been very eventful. I've been to Bulgaria for a couple of weeks where I tried to collect more stories, but the response was always the same. There was someone, but she died 40 years ago. And so I found people who could spin and weave, and I got them to show me how to do those things. I got to be a shepherdess for a few hours where I took the sheep and the goats to pasture. I learned about bees, and everything feeds back into stories. But this is, of course, what stories are related to: people's lives. I also have the Wild Women course starting in November. This will be the second year running, and we had such a wonderful time last year. So if you wanted to find more about that, I'll leave the link below. It's www.nanatomova.com/wildwomen. It will be 6 stories over 6 months, which I will tell, and then we will discuss in a small group and discover the magic, the symbols, the wonders, the hidden treasures that stories hide, just for us to discuss and uncover together. Now, for the story this month, I have a difficult story. Difficult stories have a place. It's an uncomfortable story, and uncomfortable stories also have a place. It's a story that doesn't treat women well, and these stories also have a place, because in our society, women are not treated well everywhere. And so these stories help us to know that it's been going on for a long time. The time for change is long overdue, and we need to tell them. It's a story from Russia, which I've been pondering on, walking with, thinking about for quite a long time. I properly started walking with it a few months ago, but I've been with it, really, carrying it as a heavy rock for quite a while. It's called How a Husband Weaned His Wife from Fairytales. It is just a one-page little story in a book of Russian fairy tales. It is very much a humorous tale, written down from the husband's perspective, and him beating his wife, which is what happens in the story, is meant to be funny. But I do not find it funny. I thought I'd have a go at telling it, with maybe a few women's opinions and views here and there, because often it is the women's voice that lacks from these stories that were written down. Who knows how it was told? And who knows if that woman in the story had a daughter, how she would tell it? I haven't changed the essence of the story. I haven't made any tragedies, haven't put any happy endings, but I have added the woman's voice. And the story does contain violence towards women at its heart. so please take care of yourself if you choose to listen. Here is how a husband weaned his wife from Fairy Tales. There was once an inn at the edge of a village by a forest, with a background mountainous landscape. The inn was old. The inn had walls of stone supported by beams who beamed. They loved their job. Old bent trunk trees that had the hardest job to support the roof and the walls. And the roof had a leak here and there. The innkeepers didn't have much money. But that inn was known by word of mouth, which is how the most glorious things pass from one's lips to another's ear, from lips to ear, from lips to ear. For that inn had the most wonderful of guests. The fire was always lit. They could smell the smoke of pine trees that were put on first, and an oak that would grow and burn all night long. And the fire loved the guests. But there was one condition. The innkeeper's wife only allowed people in who could tell fairy tales. That was the condition. You could pay with coin, yes, but you must be able to spin a tale or two. And so the most wonderful of guests came, ones that had travelled, merchants, people that had walked the roads, seen the seasons change, met people from different lands. Such stories, so rich. And the husband, the innkeeper, and his wife, the lover of fairy tales, got to listen to beautiful things all night long. There were stories about Baba Yaga, and there were stories about Ivan walking from here to there, following a bowl of string one time, looking for a treasure the next, looking for his lost sister another time. There were stories of the maiden Tsar, who sailed along the seas in a boat full of women. There were stories about ravens, about suns, about moons, about clever girls who knew the most important things in life. There were stories about where women were beaten by their husbands. Those stories, the woman looked and heard. There was a curtain almost that went through her eyes. She listened, but could not listen too deeply. She knew the pain of those women. She was one of them. Many stories, many travellers, much joy and the fire. As the fire burned and those flames danced in the hearth, they too enjoyed the stories, and the beams of the house just creaked in their joy of listening to these tales. The whole inn loved it. It was the condition of the wife. A wise woman she was. She knew the importance of stories, of fairy tales. And she knew that any guest that could tell fairy tales all night long knew much about life, knew much about wisdom, knew much about relationships, about things of this world and the other worlds, about things that were seen and unseen in such a person, where it was less likely that there would be a thief, a cheat, someone to take their lives while they were sleeping. But usually it would be someone who could be trusted, someone whose eyes were open, someone whose heart was open, someone who could could see things in interesting ways. All this she knew, because she too was a lover of stories. She too had grown up on them. She too had sat by a hearth with her grandmother, listening to tales being told, walking in other worlds. For as long as you have stories, you are rich. And that was the only condition. You may sleep here in our inn, as long as you can tell us fairy tales. Many people were turned away. If they said that they could not tell stories all night long, well, there was no bed for them. But somehow she knew that the right people would come. There would always be food on the table, just enough, and life would be fun and interesting and joyful. But her husband, he had an eye for gold coin. He had an insatiable thirst in his belly, not just for the ale that he drank, but for the coins that people would give. And he reproached his wife for her choice. He was not content. He tried to bite his tongue for as long as possible. He was not a gifted wordsmith like her. No, he prided himself on the strength of his fist instead. But one night, one winter's evening, when winds were howling, when there was snow and ice on the ground, when it was dark and cold, so much so that your teeth would chatter, your fingers would be blue, your eyebrows would be frozen. There was a knock upon the door, a feeble knock of fingers as hard as stone. The husband opened the door. There was an old man there, barely standing. "Please," he said, "do you have a space in the inn? I have money." Well, that was all the man wanted to know. "We have a bed," he said, "but my wife, you see, my wife, she only lets in people who can tell fairy tales." And he lifted his eyebrows at that. There was a look exchanged, a smirk. Words didn't have to be told for the meaning to be obvious that the husband, did not agree with his wife. "So," he said in a tone that was suggestive, "can you tell stories?" The old man got the hint. The old man knew that there was no choice. If he wanted a warm bed, if he wanted his soul and body to be together the following day, he needed to say yes. And this is what he did. "Yes, I can tell stories," he replied, "but on one condition. I must not be interrupted for the whole night. Otherwise there will be no story." "Granted," said the husband. stepped aside, took the coin, of course, and welcomed the old man into the inn. The wife walked forward, wiped her hands upon her apron, smiled a smile that reached her eyes, welcomed the guest, and asked them the usual question. "Can you tell fairy tales?" she said. The old man, trying to recover from the cold, just nodded, and her husband confirmed. Yes, he can tell fairy tales, but on one condition. You must not interrupt him all night long. Oh, very well, said the wife, excited. She served some warm wine. She served a good meal. When they had eaten, and their bellies were full, they were feeling slightly sleepy and warm, and the old man fell into the comfortable chair next to the fire. He breathed out a sigh of comfort and began his tale. An owl flew by a garden, sat on a tree trunk, and drank some water. An owl flew into a garden, sat on a tree trunk, and drank some water. An owl flew into a garden, sat on a tree trunk, and drank some water. An owl flew into a garden, sat on a tree trunk, and drank some water. And this is what he repeated time and time again. On and on he said, an owl flew into a garden, sat on a trunk, and drank some water. And the woman looked from one man to the other, from one man to the other, and the husband seemed to be nodding and quite enjoying himself, and she thought, what is this? What kind of a story is this? She was a woman who had heard many fairy tales before, and this just did not make it. She listened for a while. She sat on her hands. She made sure that her lips were close together. But after about half an hour of this droning noise, of this insensible things that were being said, of these sentences that didn't follow each other in a way that was pleasant to one's ear or one's mind or one's heart, she had to interrupt. What kind of story is this? She said. He keeps repeating the same thing over and over again. Why do you interrupt me? Said the old man. I told you not to argue with me. That was only the beginning. I was going to change later. The husband smiled. Smirked, really. One side of his face lifted ever so slightly, and the other side bore his teeth. His wife knew this look. That was exactly what he wanted to hear. He jumped down from the bed and began to berate his wife. You were told not to argue. You were told, you were warned, and now you have not let him finish his story. He raised his hand into a fist. The fist came upon her body. She closed her eyes and thought of the stories that she knew. She went into other worlds, across 9 mountains to the 10th. She was in Baba Yaga's hut and then back out again. She crossed rivers. She crossed mountains. She walked across forests. There were wise women who gave her food. There were nice men who gave her her heart. When she woke up the following morning, her head heavy, pounding, her body weak, feeble, her skin like a tapestry of blues and blacks. She knew then what she must do. She knew then that this day must never repeat itself. She knew that stories did not have a place at that inn any more under the eye of her husband. She knew that she deserved better. She deserved more than to be beaten by her husband. And so she made a decision. She would never ask for another story. She would accept anybody in her heart. And she would look for a way out. And from that day onwards, the husband was happy, content. It would be the day that he would remember in his memory to be the day how he weaned his wife from fairy tales. He should have done it sooner, really. How much more coin should he have gotten? All she needed was a good thrashing. That does it. The heart of the woman closed for her husband that day. The fire in that cottage never seemed to be quite alive. People noticed. The woman knew. The beams in that inn, they missed the stories. On the days that the husband drank too much mead, and she had to put him to bed, for it was a wife's responsibility. To do what her husband wanted, she was owned by him, just as the inn was owned by him, even though it had been her mother and father's business once upon a time. And so that fire missed hearing many generations worth of stories. For when her husband was in bed, nursing his hangovers, sleeping through his drunken mess, she would whisper stories to the fire. She would touch the beams that were oaks one time and tell stories to them about trees and forests. And the inn was content. And although the husband thought that he had managed to wean his wife from fairy tales, you cannot touch a person's heart, a person's choice, a person's inner life. And her inner fire always kept burning, always kept glowing. She kept those stories alive. For sometimes, even if a fire hears it, they will survive the next generation. And nothing could wean that woman of fairy tales on the inside. And that is what mattered. It's a painful story to hear, a difficult story to tell, but an important one. For surely the stories that are difficult, as I said at the beginning, need to be told, and there is a place for them in the world. A woman can leave home now. There are places she can go to ask for help, to make a different life. She is not owned by her husband where I live. But in other countries, a woman is still owned by her husband. She can file for a divorce. She can go to a friend's house or a shelter. She can leave. But in those times, in the times of the story centuries past, she could not. Her parents wouldn't take her in. No one would take her in. A spoiled woman she would be. And so she stayed in the only way that she thought possible. And she did it without losing the fire from within. Now, the story doesn't say that, not the written down version. But I think if if a woman was raised on stories, she would have somewhere to go, enough hope, enough beauty in life to retain that inner fire burning. And in this way, the story gives us hope, shows us a way out, shows us that even in the most difficult circumstances, we can keep our inner selves alive. Thank you to In Feathers for this beautiful music. Thank you so much for joining me in the Story Apothecary. See you next month.